Now that we are able to create users, it's now time to work on the authentication functionality. So on logging users in and getting that permission, this token for our logged in users, and being able to find out if a user is logged in, both on the client side for changing what we see and for disabling certain routes, as well as on the server side in different API routes we might be adding. And that's now the part where this next auth package, which we installed earlier already, becomes important. It helps us with authenticating users, and it helps us with finding out whether a user has that permission by managing that token creation and storage, both parts, behind the scenes. Now, to use NextAuth, we start by adding another API route. Because logging a user in, signing a user in, that of course also requires a request to be sent to a certain API route, where we then look into the database and find out whether we have that user in the database and whether the password is correct. And therefore, I'll create another file in that API/auth folder, but this file now needs a special name. It's a square bracket file name, so a dynamic API route, and it's a dynamic catch-all API route, which catches all unknown routes that start with API/auth. Here we can then use ... nextauth, written like this, one word, and in here we now use that nextauth package. And we need this catch-all route because the NextAuth package behind the scenes will expose multiple routes for a user login and for a user logout, for example. A couple of other routes as well. And in order to set up its own routes and handle its own routes, we need to have a catch-all route so that all those special requests to these special routes are automatically handled by the NextAuth package. We can still also define our own routes, like the sign-up route in addition, as long as we don't overwrite one of the built-in routes NextAuth exposes. If you want to find out which routes it creates, you can check out the official NextAuth documentation and click on REST API there. And these are the different routes. They all start with /API/auth, as you can tell, which will be handled by NextAuth. So we shouldn't clash with those. Now, how do we then use NextAuth here? We first of all import it in this square bracket NextAuth.js file. We import NextAuth from NextAuth. And then with this imported, we export NextAuth as a default, but not like this, but we execute it. So NextAuth here is a function which we can execute. And when we execute it, it returns a new function, a handler function. It needs to, because this is still an API route. And therefore, an API route still needs to return a function. It needs to export a function. But that exported handler function is created by NextAuth, by calling NextAuth. And when we call NextAuth, we can pass a configuration object to it. That's an object which allows us to configure NextAuth's behavior. And you can dive into the official docs, configuration options to learn about all the options you can and must set here. Now, in our case, we want to set the providers option here and set this to an array. And here we need to import something else. We need to import providers from next-auth/providers like this. And then here in the providers array, we use providers dot. And then here you can choose from the long list of supported providers. And again, check out the providers docs to learn more about the concrete way of setting up the different providers. But here we need the credentials provider, which means that we bring our own credentials. Now this takes a configuration object itself, and here we now can configure a couple of things. For example, we can set the credentials key, and then here define what our credentials are, email and password. We could use that to let NextAuth generate a login form for us. Here, however, I don't want to let NextAuth generate a forum for me. I already have one, and hence I'll not set credentials. The only thing we need to set here actually is authorize. And authorize turns out to be a method. It's a method which Next.js will call for us when it receives an incoming login request. At the moment, we're not sending such requests yet, but we will soon do so. Authorize is an async function, so it returns a promise, and as an argument, we get the credentials that were submitted. And that is our object with the data we submitted, for example, email password. In here, we now have to bring our own authorization logic, check if the credentials are valid, and tell the user if that's not the case. For example, throw an error if that's not the case. Therefore, in here, we again want to connect to the database, and hence import connect to database from the lib folder, and get hold of that client here by awaiting this. We also want to close the client later, of course. So let's already do that so that we don't forget it. And then we want to find out if we have a user for the entered email and if we have a user with that password then. So if that password is correct. Hence, let's first of all check if we have a user. For that, I'll have my users collection, which I get access to with client.db.collection users. Let's do that in one go. And then we can use the users collection to find one user where the email is equal to credentials.email. And I'm expecting that credentials will have an email property. I can expect this because it will be us who later set those credentials when we send a request from the client-side code. So I expect to have an email field in the credentials object, and then I check if I find a user with that email. We should await this because it's a asynchronous task, returning a promise, and then here we got our user. Now, if we don't find a user, if not user, then we know that there is no user with that email address. In that case, we can throw a new error where we say no user found or anything like that. Now, when you throw an error inside of authorize, authorize will reject that promise which it generates, and it will then by default redirect the client to another page. But we will be able to override this so that we stay on this login page and maybe just show an error there. But that's something we'll do later. So here we throw an error, but if we make it past this if check, we know that we found a user for the email address. That's nice, but we now also need to find out whether the password is correct. Now keep in mind that we hashed the password, so we will not be able to just compare the submitted password with the stored password. The stored password will never be equal because it's hashed. Now we can't unhash the password, but we can hash the incoming password again to find out if it's equal. But if we just call hash password again, we would also generate a different hash because it's not always the same. But bcrypt.js has a method that helps us. It has the compare function. And that allows us to find out if a plain text password matches a hashed password. So if that plain text password could result in the same hashed password. And if that's the case, we know that the passwords are equal. For this, we here export another async function. Verify password could be the function name. And here we then get the plain text password and the hashed password. So both passwords. And then we run compare. And there we pass in the plain text password and the hashed password. And await this because compare does return a promise. And that will return a boolean, which is true if the passwords are equal and false otherwise, and hence here I'll return that boolean. Then back in our authorize function, we can run verify password, and pass in credentials.password, which is the submitted password with which the user tries to log in. And as a second argument, the password stored in the database, so in that user object. So we pass in user.password as a second argument, accessing that password field which is stored in MongoDB. We need to await this because verify password is an async function and hence returns a promise. And then we got our isValid result here. Now, if this is not valid, if the password is not valid, then again we want to throw an error. We could say, could not log you in, something like this. If we make it past this if check as well, we know that we have a user for the given email address and that the password is valid. So in that case, the user is logged in, and in that case, here we should return an object. If we return an object instead of authorize, we let nextAuth know that authorization succeeded, so that the user is logged in. And this object will then actually be encoded into that JSON web token. Hence here we could, for example, include the user email. We should not pass the entire user object because we don't want to include the password. Even though it's hashed, we don't want to expose that to the client. So that's the object we return, and that will then be encoded in a JSON web token. But speaking of that, to make sure that a JSON web token is created, we should go to the next auth config object, and besides setting up our providers, also add the sessions option here. That's another option which you can set up here. Actually, it's session, not sessions. It's an object where you can configure how that session for an authenticated user will be managed, and there you got a JWT key which should be set to true, so that JSON web tokens are being used. For some other authentication providers, you have other ways of managing this. For example, that a session is stored in a database, but for credential-based authentication for this provider, you must use JWT and set this to true. As you see, it would be set to true automatically if you don't specify a database, and we aren't specifying a database because we handle all database access manually anyways with this specific provider, but nonetheless, setting it to true explicitly also isn't too bad. Now, if you do use other providers, then you might of course be able to add a database and use a session. It really depends on which authentication provider you use. For example, if you use the email authentication provider, where you get an email with a magic link sent to you, then you need to add a database in which the emails will be stored, and you don't need to use JWT. But that's just a side note. Here we are using JWT, we are using credentials, and hence we need to configure it like this. Now, before using this API route though, before sending requests, there's one thing I want to do. Client close, of course, should be called before we return, and also should be called if we throw an error, so that we still close that database connection. That is something we should do here. And actually, I just saw this should be hashed password, of course, not hash password. So that's one thing. That's now the backend. That's the authentication API route using nextAuth. Let's now find out what we do on the front end, on the client, to log users in.